Why am I here? That's the question. Well, how did I get here? Why did this happen? Why am I interested in research? Why am I interested in the cause of schizophrenia? So, my inferiority complex, Tucker talked about inferiority complex. My inferiority complex is the fact that every day when I was working in schizophrenia, I would go there and I'd feel humble. I'd feel humble because my patients and also their families were dealing with things that I didn't think that I could ever deal with. And they were doing it with grace, and they were doing it often with humour, and they were doing things I couldn't do. But my first feeling of humility that really brought me down to earth was, Tucker talked about the Maudsley Hospital. Well, the Maudsley Hospital, otherwise known as the Maudsley Hospital in the Institute of Psychiatry, is a place that thinks of itself as actually the best psychiatric hospital in the world. And when I came into psychiatry, I got through the interview process, and on the first day, I got myself into the Institute of Psychiatry as a resident, and I was full of myself, really full of myself. If you think I'm full of myself now, nowhere near as full of myself as I was on that day. And I got in, and the first person I saw was a person, young guy, African and Caribbean descent, with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. He was hearing voices, he was seeing things sometimes, and he was paranoid. And he was on some medication, but the medication hadn't worked that well. And he was the first person I saw. And I remember sort of seeing him and thinking, well, I better learn a bit more about this. Went and sat down in the office, and then I got a knock on the door. And the knock on the door was from his mother and his father. And his father was roughly the age of my father at the time. So there was a bit of a connection there. And like most proud African Caribbean men, he was never going to cry, but you could feel that that is what he wanted to do. And he asked me a few questions that I still remember today. First question was, it's happened again. Is this going to happen again to me? And I said, what do you mean? He said, I've got 4 sons. This is the second one who is suffering from schizophrenia. Is it me? Is it the family? Is it the fact that we've come to England from the Caribbean? What is it? What can I do? Is it the family? What's happened here? And then he asked another question. The second question was, what can we actually do? Those drugs aren't working, they're giving him side effects. Is there anything else that could be done? And the reason why I felt humble was for a number of different reasons. First reason is that all doctors, and actually a lot of the case managers, people who work in services who are here, and definitely all the social workers, want to be the perfect parent. That's what drives us on. We want to be the perfect parent. And when we come up against things that we just don't know the answer to, we retreat to our knowledge, and when the knowledge doesn't give us the answer, we feel sort of humiliated. We're supposed to know the answers. We're supposed to know how these things work. We're supposed to be able to help. That's what we do. We help people. I couldn't help. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know the information. And that encounter didn't go well. But I wanted to find out. So, 3 questions I wanted to answer. What's the cause of psychosis? What should I say to the parents? And is there hope for a cure? I say what do the books say, and this is to so as not to... If you were going to look on CAMH's website and you were going to ask what is the cause of schizophrenia, this is what it would say. No single cause has been found for schizophrenia, although there's a clear genetic link. Research has given us clues in the search for better ways to diagnose and treat the illness. As you know, I'm passionate about CAMH, but that is really not that helpful for me. It doesn't answer any of those questions that I have. or the patients have, or their relatives have. So when I was at the Institute of Psychiatry down in London, I went to try and find the answers, and basically people were in two camps. There were the biologists and there were the social camp. And the biologists were pretty clear that schizophrenia was a biological disease. And that's because they have studies like this. What this study shows is your risk of developing schizophrenia dependent on your relationship to somebody else who has a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So, no relationship in the general population, about 1% chance of developing schizophrenia. Then, first cousins, uncles, nephews, as you go down until you get to identical twins. So if one twin has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, the other twin has 50% chance or 48% chance of developing schizophrenia. And so they say, well, this is pretty clear. All we're doing is moving from the general population through different levels of the amount of genes people have in common. So identical twins have 100% genes in common. Fraternal twins have about 50% of their genes in common. And children of somebody with schizophrenia would have fewer genes in common. So they're saying this is genetic. Pretty clear. The fewer genes you have in common to somebody with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, the lower your risk. The more genes you have, the more risk you have. And so the first piece of work that I did as a researcher was starting to look for the genetic causes of schizophrenia. And the problem with it, we all thought we were going to be looking for Nobel Prizes, but what we found were there were loads of genes involved. Lots of different genes. And the strongest, that usually you didn't find any genetic link at all. There were, most of the genetic things seemed to be totally sporadic, new gene mutations. But then there are two genes that people talked about, one for dysbinding and another for neuregulin. They're just proteins. But those are the ones that people looked at. They said, but there's actually more evidence than just genes that schizophrenia is really biological. And they said that comes from obstetric complications. If, say, for instance, there was a problem during birth, either hypoxia during birth or a long labour, then the child has an increased chance of developing schizophrenia, about 30 or 40% increased chance. And so they said what happens is during birth, there's damage to the brain, and that damage to the brain later leads to schizophrenia. And so they said this is definitely, therefore, biological. And one of the other things they said was, have a look at this. What this shows is your chance of developing schizophrenia depending on what month of the year you were born. So, if you were born in March or December, you're at the highest risk, whereas if you're born in September, you're at lowest risk. And actually, that's for the northern hemisphere. If you looked in the southern hemisphere, then the curve is the other way up. So they say, well, there's something clearly linked to the atmosphere. It's clearly linked to the environment that causes schizophrenia because your risk changes dependent on atmospheric conditions. It is definitely that. And people have talked about viral infections, which are more common. As you all know, I'm supposed to tell you right now that you should all take your flu shot because we're just starting the flu season. And people have talked about flu, but other people have said, no, it's not flu. It's the amount of light that's available, and it's due to vitamin D. Lack of vitamin D, they say, increases the risk of developing schizophrenia. The first piece of flu work I was involved in gave me an awful allergy. I had to go into the bowels of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and look up the rates of flu in the Caribbean in 1917 and 1918. which would have worked perfectly apart from the fact that I'm really allergic to dust. So it was a very strange piece of research which was punctuated by collecting data, going and getting an antihistamine, and at those days they didn't have the non-sedative antihistamines. So I would then fall asleep in all of the paperwork, wake up again, do a bit of more work, take more antihistamines, and at the end of it, it showed nothing. Total waste of time. We couldn't find flu linked to the rate of psychosis at all. But the interesting thing was that if you look in lower income countries, there does seem to be a link, but not in high income countries. Cannabis. Before I was told off, there was a lovely flag. Have you ever seen the Oh Cannabis flag? On the, no? There is an Oh Cannabis flag which is on the web, which is a green and white flag with a cannabis leaf instead of a maple leaf in the middle, and it says Oh Cannabis. And somebody, once I showed it and laughed, and they said, "This is not funny." And I said, "No, it's not funny." And it's never been shown again. So, interesting things about Sweden. At the age of 18, if you go into, everybody goes into national service. And when you go into national service, you have one of the most extensive medical examinations you're going to have. You have these huge questionnaires, and they ask you all sorts of things, like, you know, how many drinks you've had, how much cannabis you've taken, everything like that. And then they take all of this data and they link it to your health records. The fact that they do that is extraordinary. The fact that anybody answers it is even more extraordinary, but people answer it. And so what they've managed to do here is ask people at the age of 18, how much cannabis have you had? No occasions, 1 occasions, 2 to 4, 5 to 10, 11 to 50, and more than 50. Yeah.
That was per year or in a lifetime or what?
By the age of 18. Yeah, they just ask them by the age of 18, when you come into this, how much have you had?
And
yes.
The risk of them themselves developing schizophrenia.
That's right. Yeah. Everybody's interested in cannabis. I wonder why. Right. So, so they link the records. And because they link the records, they can then see whether people get a diagnosis of schizophrenia, whether they're admitted for schizophrenia. Yeah? And they followed people up. And your chance of developing schizophrenia was sort of linked to the number of times you'd had cannabis by the age of 18. In fact, if you'd taken cannabis 50 times by the age of 18, you increased your rate by about 4-fold, 5-fold. So people were completely clear. Cannabis.
I can see this a different way, though.
Yeah.
Maybe the higher rate just shows that the person already knows they're troubled.
Of course.
So
Of course.
maybe it doesn't mean that cannabis causes it to develop.
That's right. So it, just in case they didn't pick it up on the microphone, the argument was reverse causality. It's not that the cannabis is causing psychosis. It's by the age of 18, perhaps people are already troubled. And one of the things we know about schizophrenia is there are symptoms that can occur very young and that they can develop over time. Maybe someone had some early symptoms, and because of those early symptoms, they started using cannabis. And so rather than the cannabis causing the schizophrenia, it could be that there were already problems, and that is what we're picking up in those sorts of studies. Could be. Another question.
I had the same cause and effect.
That's true. No one wants to believe that cannabis causes schizophrenia in Canada. This is fine, because it probably doesn't. Has an effect, definitely effect. This chap called Jim Van Os does this brilliant study, looked at all of the studies that had ever been, and he said that at most it doubles your risk. But if you got rid of all of the cannabis that there was, you'd only decrease the rate of schizophrenia by 8%, and cannabis by itself does not cause schizophrenia. By itself, it's not sufficient by itself. Other things must be going on. That's what he found. So it's good that you're intuitive researchers. It did only take the research community a number of decades to come up with the same things that you worked out in 2 minutes. But, yeah. So what do the biologists tell us? Biologists are pretty clear. There's information, there's environmental, there's straightforward information from toxic substances such as cannabis. There's obstetric complications, there's genetic evidence, and they will tell you schizophrenia is biological. And they'll say there's also brain evidence that shows it. These are the MRI scans of twins. One of them has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, the other one doesn't. The person with a diagnosis of schizophrenia has bigger ventricles. And the actual grey matter, which is here, white matter, grey matter, is thinner. Big ventricles, thinner grey matter, something definitely going on in the cortex, which is here, and in the subcortical grey matter. Something is going on. They will tell you it's completely clear. Schizophrenia is biological, and that there are certain pathways that they have found which are dopaminergic. And dopamine is just a neurotransmitter. I had a different slide up for the purposes of you, but we haven't got that. So I'll tell you, dopamine's a neurotransmitter. It's a neurotransmitter that if you have too much of it, it can give you symptoms that look like hallucinations and delusions. It is released by cannabis. It is released by amphetamines. If you give people amphetamines, they will produce delusions and hallucinations. Slam dunk, dopamine causes schizophrenia. Not only that, if you block the action of dopamine, a lot of the delusions and hallucinations can go away. So it's completely clear to the biologists that schizophrenia is biological. So why is there a social camp? It's a social camp because they have a different view of it. Their view runs like this, that if you do a different sort of study, some epidemiological studies where you're looking at rates and you're looking at other risk factors, you find that there are a number of social factors that increase your risk of developing schizophrenia. And those social factors actually have a higher, seem to be much more important than some of the biological factors. They seem to be more forceful. So, if you are separated from your parents for 1 year before the age of 16, your risk of developing schizophrenia increases by about 300%. Separation from your parents seems to make a difference. Social adversity in childhood makes a difference. Bullying makes a difference. Increases your risk. When we talked about the obstetric complications, it increased your risk by about 30%. Bullying increases your risk by 300%. So the people in the social camp say, look, this isn't, it is most definitely social, and stress is important. If you live in a stressful place, that increases your risk of schizophrenia. And more little daily hassles, everybody's looking for big life events, loss of a job and things like that. It's actually the little daily hassles that seem to be linked to developing schizophrenia. Financial insecurity, things like that. But your biggest risk factor is not being bullied. Your biggest risk factor is not separation from your parents. The biggest risk factor is being born and brought up in a city. Not moving to a city when you've already been born, being born and brought up in a city. The bigger the city, the bigger the risk. Whereas if you got rid of all of cannabis, you'd decrease the rate of schizophrenia by 8%. The social camp will tell you that that cities themselves are 30% of the risk of developing psychosis. Yeah.
So what kind of cities? Because you can say a big city is quite different, like say Toronto is quite different than New York, but Toronto is considered a big city, or Zurich is a city which is very different than Hong Kong.
You're completely right. And no one has been able to disaggregate what it is about a city. And they haven't done those studies. What they have done is they've just shown on population and density basis, the denser the city, the bigger the risk. The bigger the city, the bigger the risk. Straight line graph from a village to 1 million people. Straight line. The social people also say that it's clearly social because of this data. Now, what we're always told in presentations is never to put data up with loads of little lines that people can't read. It's called bad presentation skills. But you don't have to read the fact. In fact, actually, I could do an eye test on somebody on the front. No. To read this, all you need to know is this is every good study that there's ever been on the rate of schizophrenia in immigrant groups compared to host populations. If the rate in immigrant groups was the same as a host population, then all of these lines would be on here. They're not. They moved over to the right. And what that shows is that your risk of developing schizophrenia, if you're an immigrant, is about 250 times higher. Sorry, 250% higher. So it's 2.5 times higher. But why people are really interested in the social part of this is because all immigrants aren't the same. So if you're white and you move to a country that's predominantly white, your risk is at about 250% higher. But if you are black and you move to a country that's white, you have to double that risk again, 450%. So immigration is a risk, but if you're black and you immigrate to somewhere that's predominantly white, that's even higher risk. We looked into this from the social perspective and said, is it due to racism? Because that's what the community said, racism. And this is a study of about 4,500 people in the United Kingdom. And they were all from black and minority ethnic groups. And we asked them whether they'd been victims of no racism, verbal abuse, or physical abuse. And then we looked at the rate of schizophrenia in those groups. And it's pretty clear that if you'd not been a victim of racism, you had about a normal rate of about 0.5%, verbal only, a higher risk, and if you'd been physical abuse, higher still. Then we looked at people who hadn't been victims of racism, and we asked them whether they feared being a victim of racism by saying, is this the sort of place where employers will discriminate against employees? And we found a very similar sort of thing. People who thought no employers discriminate, some or most. Again, a straight line graph and the rate of schizophrenia. I'm waiting for this work is flawed, totally flawed. We think it's flawed. I did it and I think it's flawed. It's flawed because we're asking people whether they had been victims of racism, but we're also asking them and measuring the rate of schizophrenia in the same group. It could be that people who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia are more likely to experience discrimination. It could be that they're more likely to notice discrimination. So this study doesn't tell us that much. So what we did to try and get around that is we did a follow-up study. We went to the Netherlands, and that's because they had the data. And again, 5,000 people. We asked them whether they had been victims of discrimination due to sex, race, sexual preference, age, or disability. We then did a mental state test, and everybody who had a paranoid personality or a mental health problem was taken out. So, when I say taken out of the study, which means that there were 4,700 people left, and we followed them up for 3 years. And what we found was if you'd been the victim of discrimination, you're about 3 times more likely, so 300% increase in risk of developing psychotic symptoms over the 3-year period. It wasn't whether you were black, it wasn't whether you were gay, it was whether you had been the victim of discrimination. And the more discrimination, the higher your risk of developing psychotic symptoms over the 3-year period. And we published that in the British Journal of Psychiatry. So the social model, some ways, is similar to the biological model. Again, it starts in childhood. Again, people talk about trauma and stress. And they think that what happens is trauma and stress changes the way you think. You start, you start worrying about other people's intentions. You start trying to work out why these things are happening to you. You start sometimes trying to withdraw into your own world. And these are prototypical sort of ways of thinking which later in your life, under stress, can lead to psychotic thought. And this is what the social camps say. It's stress. Stress is bad for you, and these adverse experiences change the way you think, and this new way of thinking that you get because of stress in childhood lead you to be at risk of developing psychotic symptoms. That's what they say. Here's the problem. Here's the problem. Here's the problem for the biologists. So, problem for the biologists is if you are an identical twin and one of you develops schizophrenia, then the other one only has 50% chance of developing schizophrenia, but you have exactly the same genes. So you've got exactly the same genetic code. You've got exactly the same biology. So why isn't it 100%? And this can be rewritten as a half-empty, half-full question. Now, I'm British, and my son says because I'm British, I am always half-empty, okay? The Americans apparently are half-full, and the Canadians choose, okay? That's what he says. So, from a biological point of view, they will say, hey, just a second, nothing is as good as a 50% chance. This shows 50% chance if you've got an identical twin, it's definitely biological. And the social camps say only 50% chance if you're an identical twin, it's definitely social. So we're going around in circles, half full, half empty. Trade-offs. Trade-offs, trade-offs, trade-offs. Do you know why the American car companies did badly compared to the Japanese car companies? The story seems to run like this. The American car companies used to be clear that they had to make a trade-off. The trade-off was between cheap cars that were unreliable and expensive cars that were reliable. That was a trade-off. Had to do that. That's the only way it could work. They were happy with that trade-off, and people spent a lot of time buying cheap cars and expecting them to break, and then eventually breaking the bank to buy expensive cars that eventually worked. The Japanese said, we don't like the trade-off. And they put money into research and technology specifically to make a cheap car that was reliable. That's what they did. What they saw was a trade-off, and they said, where there's a trade-off, there's an opportunity of thinking differently, of doing things differently. And at the moment, when I was reading through and trying to find out so that I had the information so I could tell the patients, I had the classic trade-off. It either had to be biological or it had to be social, and there the twain shall meet. This bit is not supposed to be in this talk. I'm going to give it anyway, okay? Causation theorists don't think like that, because this is about the cause of schizophrenia. They don't believe in trade-offs. In fact, the theories of causations have never been trade-offs. When people first started thinking about the causes of illness, they had these, like Hippocrates and others, they were talking about humours and stuff coming out of the ground, and miasma theory, and it was all nonsense, but they had a theory. But the interesting thing about that nonsense was when the first people started doing public health, they didn't say, out with that theory. They said, we'll build on it. So the first people who were doing public health were interested in sanitizing the slums. They didn't think, they didn't know what caused illness, but they thought it was something to do with the places that people lived. And so they wanted to sanitize the slums, and that's why you got all of those Victorian drains and stuff like that. They wanted to sanitize the slums. They didn't know what caused illness, but they thought they could make it better. Place-based. Then came germ theory. Now, germ theory is pretty straightforward, but it's very, very linear. The idea of germ theory, which came after they found bugs, was that you catch a bug, you get the illness. Okay? The interesting thing about that is it for a little while, completely replaced this area-based theory of causation, that somehow a slum caused an illness. It said, no, forget that. It's the germ. But it didn't last. And the reason it didn't last is very quickly people said, yeah, but how do you get the germ? And so the epidemiological triangle came. You got a germ, you got an individual, you got an area, and they all interact. And so there was this idea of the epidemiological triangle, and that was the theory of causation that went for years and years and years, decades, and this was one of the theories of causation. The point of this is not to learn the theory of causation, it's to understand that when people have been thinking about causation, they have been trying to build on things that went before. Now, the epidemiological triangle worked for germs, but doesn't work for heart disease. There's no germ. What there are loads of different risk factors working at loads of, then they work together. And so they said, well, what there are is there's this risk factor, there's the environment, there's the individual, that's a triangle. There's another risk factor, there's the individual, there's the environment, that's another triangle. And they came up with this idea of a web of causation, of all these triangles that knit together. And the interesting thing about just the concept, if you think about the web, is it's complex. Forget about the spider, for those of you who are spider phobes. But it's complex, but the interesting thing about the idea of a web is if you just move a bit of the web, all of the other bits of the web move. So all of these little triangles with risk factors, behavioral or in the community, they all link together, and that's the idea of the web of causation. But the web of causation is linked to the triangle, which is linked to germ theory, which is linked to slums and sanitizing slums. There's a history to it. Everything builds on something else. Now we've got to another level. We've got to a level where psychiatry has met public health, and we've got a completely different model. And this is this, have you ever seen those babushka dolls? Yeah? And what they say is these webs, there's a web of causation at an individual level, then there's a web of causation at the community level, and there are all of these different webs of causation. And if we've got to think about causation, we've got to think of lots of different sciences at different levels in order to understand it. By now, everybody is lost, and so we get to talk about dinosaurs. So, tell me, which of these dinosaurs is causing the other dinosaurs to smoke? You can choose. Ringleader is number 1. Hands up, yes or no? Nobody. Ringleader is number 2. Hands up. 3. Ringleader is the shifty one with the cigarette. Yeah, yeah, yes, right. So, this is obviously a Larson cartoon. It's available on the net. I haven't broken any copyrights I know of. If I have, I apologise. But what it does is help us think of multi-level causation, but thinking about cigarette smoking because it's easier to think about. So if we're thinking about cigarettes causing lung disease, we would start off and we'd say, well, we know that the actual nicotine has an effect on the cell, okay? So molecular level. We'd know that that cell has an impact on the way the lung functions. So an organ level. We would know that there are choices people make about whether they smoke or not at an individual level. We have just done this group question about what we think is going on and why one of the dinosaurs is smoking. So we know there's an interaction at a group level. And then the question that I asked when I saw this is, how did those dinosaurs get cigars? Cigarettes or cigars? We don't know, but there's a societal level thing. The interesting thing about this when you're a researcher is simple. All of them have different ways of investigating them. They have totally different sciences. You wouldn't use molecular genetics to try and work out interpersonal interaction. It wouldn't work very well. You wouldn't look at interpersonal group theory in order to work out how your cell works. No. That's why there are all of these multiple levels. But the levels interact, and it's the interaction is where the fun is. The thing I want you to remember about trade-offs is trade-offs are opportunity. Anytime, if you remember nothing about the causes of schizophrenia, you know that every time you see a trade-off, it is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to think differently. And so what I did was look back in the literature. And when you look back in the literature, these two solitudes are nonsense. Actually, the urban environment increases your chance, which is supposed to be social, actually increases your chance of physical problems. It doesn't only increase your chance of social problems, it increases your chance of physical problems. It increases your chance of taking cannabis often and other drugs, it increases your chance of pregnancy problems, it increases your chance of malnutrition, it increases your chance of problems with vitamin D. Also, when you look back at the literature, and this was done by our Dutch colleagues, your chance of this idea that there's an increased risk of developing psychosis if you live in a city actually only works if you're living if you've got a genetic risk. So it's only people who have a genetic risk of schizophrenia that have this city effect. No genetic risk, no city effect. So this idea that there are two solitudes doesn't work. This is from a paper in Nature, and all it shows is people without a genetic risk for schizophrenia, people with a genetic risk for schizophrenia, and it is just showing what I said, your risk of developing schizophrenia if you live in an urban area, right at the top, if you're gene positive, greater than if you're genetic. If you haven't got a genetic loading, again, urbanicity and schizophrenia, and then this is not schizophrenia, this is any untreated psychotic disorder, exactly the same. No genes, sort of some genetic link, acting with living in a city. Yeah?
I might be curious, in the city, which has millions of people, say, how many significant relationships would the schizophrenic person have?
Let's come back to that, because you're trying to work out how many different people link with.
All alone or have 150 friends?
So this is when people develop schizophrenia. Most people develop schizophrenia when they're still in contact with their family and they've recently been in school. So they'd have a lot of contacts. Yeah. This shows the same thing for a different reason. This is looking at what happens if you give people cannabis. And this is showing right at the top whether if you take cannabis you develop symptoms, whether you've got a gene, whether you've got genes, genetic risk for schizophrenia or not. And this is whether you actually produce psychotic symptoms when you take cannabis, if you've got no genetic loading than if you have. And this is whether cannabis has an effect on shrinking your grey matter. Gene negative, gene positive, it's shrinking your grey matter. The only point of showing this is showing that this idea that there's the environment and there are biology and the two things don't mix is not true. Genes have a link with the environment. The effect of genes is in part due to a link with risk factors in the environment, and the two things are not separate. You had a question.
Yes, how do you know that you're predisposed?
Okay, so what they did here is they did a... Excuse me. He's got his bins on and I've just blown his eardrums. They are covered by OHIP. So what happens is that they look and they say, you know, they look at the family history, and this is what they did here. They just did family histories, basically. And they did family histories of people who had diagnosis of schizophrenia in the family history, but also looked at other risk factors, such as people who didn't have a diagnosis, but perhaps had symptoms that could be considered a sort of prodromal of schizophrenia. It's not perfect. All they tried to do is say, these people we think don't have any genetic risk, these people do have genetic risk somewhere in the family, and what's the rate? The whole point is just to show that there's a link. So they're not two solitudes. They're actually linked. And why this becomes interesting is because of where the science has gone. So in the past, what we had was the biologists and we had the social people or psychologists, and there the twain shall meet. But where we are now is saying, well, just a second, it's the interaction. It's somewhere in the middle. And so the concepts have moved forward. They've said, well, just a second, schizophrenia is not a problem of the brain, and it's not a problem of society. It's a problem of the interaction between the brain and society. And so what people have started to look at is the mind. And they said that schizophrenia, if it's anything, is a problem of the mind. The mind is that part of the brain that interacts with the environment. That's what it is. It's the mind. That's what the brain is actually, or parts of the brain are for. The brain is there to help us adapt to our environment. That's what it's for. And it has a whole bunch of ways of helping us adapt to the environment. And if schizophrenia is anything, or where you're going to find schizophrenia, it is in the adaptation. Looking at the brain won't give you the answer. Looking at the environment won't give you the answer. Looking at the interaction might. And that's where we've moved to, this idea of the mind. And it changes the way we think about mental illness. If mental illness is just the brain trying to adapt us to the environment, if it's just the brain that trying to adapt us to the environment, then we're adapting all the time. And then it's a question. Is one type of adaptation allowed? Is another type of adaptation not allowed? Is mental illness, is schizophrenia just types of adaptation that we don't like, that won't allow us to function in society, that won't allow us to get on in society? Is that what it is? If so, then the causes start becoming very interesting, because some of the cause is that adaptation, but others of the cause are how we react to the adaptation. And so that's where we're moving to. If you were born in the ocean and you were weightless, you would not develop muscles to walk. You might be able to, if you're just weightless, you wouldn't develop muscles to walk. You need the environmental stimulus to get your muscles to grow. You need gravity. If your brain is not stimulated properly, it doesn't grow properly. So it's not just adaptation in later life, it's actually adaptation during growth. And that's what may be going wrong. Maybe, there's adaptation that is going wrong during growth and during childhood years that later produce a risk of developing schizophrenia. And that's what people have been starting to look at. These are some of the causes people are looking at. They look at the sort of symptoms that people develop in schizophrenia, and they start saying, has something happened so that people haven't learned the skills to not jump to conclusions or not think in a paranoid way, to test out reality, to know where I finish and you start, to know that my own thoughts are not voices, they're my own thoughts. Is it a disrupted adaptation process which is partly due to the way that people are brought up? Is it stress that's occurring when you're young that actually changes the adaptation process? And people have looked psychologically at adaptation processes, but they've also started looking at different processes. And these processes are really, I keep on saying this because I obviously am just a little bit interested in this, okay? So, we used to think that once the brain was formed, that was it. Once your neurons were there, that was it. And you've probably heard lots and lots and lots of stuff now about neuroplasticity. Have you heard about that? Yeah? So, if you get on a cycle and you cycle for half an hour a day, you grow your brain. Now, you might not grow it the way you want to, but you do grow your brain. Not only that, genes, which everybody thought never changed, you have your genetic code, that's it. That's not how it works. Your genes are there, but the difference between your genetic code and what you actually look like are mediated by a group of proteins, and people call the whole process epigenetics. And what epigenetics is, it's the science of changing the way your genes work so that you adapt to today's environment. Otherwise, you think we'd all be dead. Yeah? If we had to wait for the whole Darwinian process to go through, we have these genes, we have to wait for natural selection, then we have some more genes, then we wait for natural selection, and we have some more genes. If anything severe happened, we would, we would not survive. So these little proteins are sensitive to the environment, and they change the way that genes work. And they do this by sort of doing some chemical changes to the genetic structure. And so when those genes go to sort of create other proteins, they work in a different way. They're also the same chemicals which are important for the growth of brain tissue. And then there are other chemicals which aren't about the growth of brain tissue, they're about stopping brain tissue getting damaged. And so we suddenly found, we haven't got much information, but we know that the brain and your genes aren't static. They are in total interaction with the environment all of the time. Okay? So some people find this a little bit difficult, but let me start with the theory of genes lead to illness. Have you heard of phenylketonuria? Yeah? Phenylketonuria is an illness that kills kids. It is a genetic illness. If you have two genes that for this illness, it can kill a kid. And every kid gets a skin prick test to make sure that they don't have two genes for PKU. But in order to die from PKU, you have to eat phenylalanine. Because what the genes do, what this genes do is they produce an enzyme which breaks down phenylalanine. If you don't break down phenylalanine, you die. So if you've got two genes and you haven't got that enzyme, you don't break down the phenylalanine, it builds up in your body and you die. So even if you have the genetic code, you don't necessarily die from PKU. Depends what you eat. Genes linked to the environment cause disease. The treatment is catch it early in the skin prick test, and you make sure that that kid never comes anywhere near any phenylalanine. All done. You just remove it from the diet. So genes do not necessarily lead to illness. Genes plus environment leads to illness. And these mechanisms change not only the action of genes, that they are things that change the reaction of genes to the environment. They're incredibly exciting for everybody. You can change your genes. You can be taller. You can be shorter. What we used to think was that your risk was either one or the other. What we thought was we either have to try and treat the brain, or we have to do something in society, and we can't do both. And now it becomes increasingly clear that we have been missing the point, because the cause of schizophrenia is not actually the environment, it's not actually the brain, it's the interaction. And so giving drugs to block symptoms, such as dopamine, is interesting, but maybe if we get to that mechanism, maybe if we think of psychological treatments that will reverse the way that people think to decrease the risk of them developing psychotic thought. Maybe if we start looking at epigenetics and start working how we can turn off that response to cannabis. Maybe if we can start thinking about how we can get people on treadmills doing neurogenesis, you can sort of, because of the neuroplasticity just due to exercise, but maybe then we can link that to psychological treatments that will help produce different pathways to thinking that will decrease the chance of developing psychotic symptoms or undermine psychotic symptoms or produce a different pathway. If you had a problem, say for instance you have a damage to part of your brain and you can't move your arm, one of the things we try and do is try and teach you to use another part of your brain to move your arm. That's what we try and do. Can we circumvent those processes in schizophrenia? So, I was supposed to tell you about the causes of schizophrenia. The causes of schizophrenia for me are very clear. It's due to us learning how to produce psychotic thought. It's increased by some biological and genetic factors. They work together in order to increase our risk. And then stress comes along and we don't know what to do with it and we start producing symptoms. But that is not the cause of schizophrenia. 15% of people in Toronto will have a psychotic symptom this year. 15%. You've all probably had one and you don't even necessarily know. A lot of people, have psychotic symptoms. They are common. Psychotic symptoms are incredibly common in grief, really common in grief. Psychotic symptoms are common when people have high fevers. People can have hallucinations and can be delusional, but they don't last. The question is not only how you generate the symptoms, the question is how those symptoms then get received by a community and become an illness. What if, when somebody had some early symptoms, we were able to intervene so that those symptoms didn't become chronic? What if they didn't have as much social stress and so didn't keep on reacting to produce other symptoms? The causes of schizophrenia are not individual. They're an individual in the environment. They're an interaction between the individual and the environment. And part of it is the acceptance of difference that we have to work with. So, back to where we started, what do I tell them? Well, I think you can say to the parents, you're not the cause of schizophrenia. There's not one cause of schizophrenia. It's not one thing that happens to you. Even if you have a high genetic load, you'll realize I should have said earlier, that if you were a parent and you have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, the most likely thing, 85% chance that your kid will not develop schizophrenia. You're not the cause. Genes just increase risk, but loads of other things have to happen for that risk to lead to schizophrenia. If you smoke cannabis, not a great idea before the age of 18, it seems, but the cannabis itself, just by itself, isn't going to give you schizophrenia. It's just increasing your risk. But one of the things that we need to think about is if we have that knowledge and we have the knowledge that it's about interactions at an individual between their brain and the environment, between them and society, between society and the treatment services which don't get people early, then the question is, what do we do with that new knowledge? And a lot of people will look back and they'll say that we haven't done the best we've done from this idea of not understanding that trade-offs are an opportunity. But, belying my British past, I actually think that rather than the glass being half empty, it's half full. That's because I've moved over here. And that we actually have, with all of this science, now a bright future in front of us in thinking about what we can actually now do to prevent and treat schizophrenia rather than just work out what the risks are. So, thank you very much.